who was recently re-elected as the Prime Minister of Israel, is responsible for sending unmanned warplanes to Ukraine. These warplanes have begun to be used against the Russian forces that are occupying Ukraine. Benjamin Netanyahu holds the record for the longest tenure of any Israeli prime minister in the country's history. During the past few weeks, they have stated in an interview with a CNN television channel that they are considering the shipment of military equipment for the Ukrainian army. At the same time, Netanyahu stated that they are attempting to offer some form of assistance to the Ukrainian army, and that they carried out their operations against Iranian ammunition shipments to Russia in order to disrupt the cooperation between Russia and Iran. He also stated that they are attempting to aid the Ukrainian army in some way. Netanyahu has stated that a decision regarding the deployment of Iron Dome air defense systems to Ukraine has not yet been made. However, they have other objectives in mind for the Ukrainian armed forces. 3 weeks after the speech, Netanyahu made the decision to send Israel Aerospace Industries, IAI, aircraft equipped with the Kamikaze unmanned combat system, which is Israel's most popular unmanned combat system. The Israeli government has abandoned its position of neutrality in the conflict between Russia and Ukraine by sending 13 unmanned fighter jets to Ukraine. Russian forces have been attempting to take control of the city of Bakhmut for a number of months now. We've been working hard to dislodge Ukrainian forces who have been stationed in this area for a long time. However, due to the defense line that was established by the Ukrainian army in this region, the Russian forces are unable to take control of the city after they were defeated in the city of Soledar. The Ukrainian army is putting up a significant fight in this area so that they do not suffer the same fate in the city of Bakhmut. However, Vladimir Putin, the leader of Russia, is extremely frustrated that Russian forces have not been successful in seizing Bakhmut for a considerable amount of time. Following a discussion with Valery Gerasimov, the head of the Russian General Staff, Vladimir Putin made the decision to launch a large-scale operation in order to seize control of the city of Bakhmut. Valery Gerasimov, the Russian military's chief of staff, and Evgeny Prigozhin, the founder of the Wagner mercenary company, began moving Russian forces from Soledar to Bakhmut. The Opinion Intelligence Service became aware of this fact as soon as it was informed that Russian forces had begun to arrive in Bakhmut from the city of Soledar. The Russian army was making preparations to launch a fresh assault. A commander of the Ukrainian army who was stationed in the back much of the country reported to the leadership of the Ukrainian army that the Russian army was preparing a new offensive. In response, the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense made the decision to use unmanned fighter jets that had been provided by the Israeli government in order to assist the Ukrainian armed forces. On the Bakhmut front, the Ukrainian army devised a plan to foil the Russian military's mission to deliver supplies to the city of Bakhmut in the form of a supply convoy. The path that Wagner and Russian troops would take to deploy themselves from the city of Soledar was discovered. The Ukrainian soldiers stationed in the city of Bakhmut took a significant calculated risk when they moved away from the front line to set up a large ambush for the Russian troops along the highway that connects Bakhmut and Soledar. The Ukrainian soldiers attacked from the wooded areas along the highway while waiting for the Israeli unmanned warplanes to launch their assault. Following a period of several hours of waiting, the Russian convoy eventually came into view. The Israeli military deployed 8 unmanned fighter jets from Bakhmut and entered Soldar's airspace. Unaware of anything going on around them, the Russian soldiers continued to move forward until they spotted the Israeli drones. However, it was already too late. The Israeli drones flew directly over the Russian convoy and fired their missiles at the various Russian military vehicles as they passed below. The explosion that occurred in the vehicle that was leading the Russian convoy resulted in a significant obstruction on the highway. The Russian forces were unable to make any further advances, so they became trapped. The Ukrainian soldiers opened fire on themselves from the cover of the forest, effectively cutting off the advance of the Russian troops. The Russian soldiers intended to exit their vehicles and launch an assault, but at that precise moment, Israeli unmanned warplanes launched their second attack. As a result, the Israelis were successful in preventing the Russian soldiers from launching an assault. Because of the missile that was launched by the drones, the lives of hundreds of Russian soldiers were taken. Following the assault by the Israeli drone, Ukrainian forces stepped up their offensive and were successful in pushing back against the Russian forces. It is estimated that over 500 of the more than 800 Russian soldiers who were in the process of traveling to the city of Bakhmut perished along the way. Because the Russian forces were unable to effectively defend themselves against the assaults launched by the Ukrainian army, they were forced to pack their belongings into their vehicles and evacuate the area. The Israeli government was able to send an unmanned war plan to the Russian government, which resulted in the Russian forces not being able to take the city of Bakhmut. This operation, which was carried out by the Ukrainian army, was conceived of in the Ukrainian parliament with a great deal of excitement. With the assistance of military supplies provided by Israel, the Ukrainian army successfully carried out an operation against Russian forces for the very first time. It is highly unlikely that this is the first time that the Israeli government has provided equipment to the Ukrainian military. However, it has recently come to light that Israel has been providing assistance to Ukraine for a very long time through the provision of intelligence support to the Ukrainian military. The Ukrainian army has been able to carry out a number of successful operations thanks to the assistance of the Israeli government. The Israeli military and civilian intelligence agency, the Mossad, established a separate team specifically for the purpose of supplying the Ukrainian army with intelligence support. This team's exclusive mission was to support the Ukrainian army. Additionally, it has provided Ukraine with cutting-edge radar systems in an effort to prevent Russian forces from conducting airstrikes against Ukraine. But the most interesting thing that has happened in recent times is the statement that the United States has made. Officials from the United States made the announcement that the Israeli government had long ago supplied the Ukrainian army with ammunition and other military equipment, with the assistance of the United States of America and Israel. It was reported that all of the ammunition that had been stored in a storage facility inside the borders of Israel had been transferred to the Ukrainian army. Following these admissions by the United States, this was confirmed by the Israeli government. On the other hand, it was reported that the United States sent the majority of the ammunition. During the first few months of the conflict, the Russian army made rapid headway into the territory controlled by the Ukrainians. The Ukrainian army was pushed back from 4 of the largest regions in Ukraine by the Russian army, which was able to successfully occupy these regions and take control of them. The leader of Russia, Vladimir Putin, did not waste any time and immediately attempted to illegally annex the regions of Ukraine that are known as Zaporizhia, Luhansk, Kherson, and Donetsk. Nevertheless, Putin's decision to annex these regions was met with a significant amount of pushback from people all over the world. Russian soldiers coerced Ukrainian citizens to take part in an illegal referendum that was organized by Putin, despite the fact that those Ukrainian citizens living in the region did not want to take part in the referendum. At gunpoint, Russian soldiers entered the homes of Ukrainian citizens and coerced them into participating in this election. Putin came next, followed by these 4 regions. Putin's decision to annex the territory, on the other hand, was rejected by every single nation. Even the Chinese government, which is widely known to have a positive relationship with Russia, has stated that they do not recognize the annexation decision made by Russia. Vladimir Putin has always believed that the Russian army would be able to make such rapid advances into Ukraine and occupy the remaining territories in such a short amount of time. However, the countries that are Ukraine's allies have proven to be a significant barrier for Russia. Since the beginning of the conflict, one of the most significant sources of support for the Ukrainian army has come from the United States and other Western countries, supplying it with manufactured military equipment as well as financial resources. The arsenals of the Ukrainian armed forces are now stocked with weapons of a very high technological level, thanks to the allied countries' provision of the necessary equipment. The advancement of Russian forces in Ukraine is slowed as a result of this. The Ukrainian army is now equipped with the same level of modern military technology as the Russian forces, thanks to the introduction of more modern and technologically advanced weapons. As time went on, he began developing Mars missiles and Patriot defense systems. Tanks such as the Abrams and the Leopard have been provided to the Ukrainian army. Following the introduction of this equipment, the balance of power in the conflict between Russia and Ukraine shifted in favor of Ukraine. The Ukrainian army switched sides and joined the side that was attacking rather than the side that was resisting. The entirety of the world was taken aback by Estonia's action. Putin saw the Baltic as a narrow body of water. The most recent assistance provided to the Ukrainian armed forces virtually ensured that Kyiv would not fall. Poland made the decision to join the war. Because Poland made this crucial move, the rest of the world was able to see that it was only a matter of time before the war became a European war. Despite the fact that everyone is frightened by this situation, it does clear the way for Ukraine to continue making its crucial moves provided to the Ukrainian armed forces virtually ensured that Kyiv would not fall. Poland made the decision to join the war. Because Poland made this crucial move, the rest of the world was able to see that it was only a matter of time before the war became a European war. Despite the fact that everyone is frightened by this situation, it does clear the way for Ukraine to continue making its crucial moves. However, as a result of the achievements of the developments, Putin's roadmaps sparked widespread concern around the world. In the final days of the war between Russia and Ukraine, the Ukrainian army started to show signs of a different priority due to the fact that Ukraine was at a much more successful point politically. This was the case because Ukraine had gained a significant amount of ground politically. Following one another, a great number of nations came out in support of Ukraine. But as soon as the news broke about Putin's potentially disastrous move, the entire world began to organize against him. The Ukrainian intelligence service and the Israeli intelligence service both recently obtained a very important piece of information. The recent invasion of Ukraine by Russia is not the country's first or its last attempt to expand its borders in this part of the world. To put it another way, Putin is currently making preparations to enter a number of countries located in this region. This is something that has started to vary across the entire world. That is why the army of Ukraine is of such vital importance. If Putin is successful in invading Ukraine, the conflict will quickly escalate into a very serious problem for the Baltic states as well as for Europe as a whole. That is something that no nation on earth is interested in. The European Union and NATO started providing the least amount of support to this region after coming to the realization that if this is allowed to happen, it will eventually lead to a world war. However, the unexpected exit came from Estonia. After suffering a string of losses in the Black Sea, Vladimir Putin has made the executive decision to relocate his battle fleets and nuclear submarines to the Baltic Sea. Although this circumstance made it impossible for Russia to achieve dominance in the Black Sea, it led to a very serious state of confusion in the Baltic, where people began to view the Russian military and fleets as a potential threat. The Baltic countries came together to formulate a response to Putin's actions. Putin was particularly perplexed by Norway's persistent actions that posed a threat to the Russian fleet as well as the Baltics. But Estonia made the statement that will put an end to this. Some countries in NATO, particularly those in the east, wanted to put pressure on Ukraine to come to the peace table. This statement will put an end to this. The first country to serve as an example is Croatia. The Ukrainian army was told by Croatia that there was no way they could normally topple Russia and that they needed to immediately surrender. And that there should be no support for the Ukraine. Almost immediately after these statements, this caused NATO to become extremely agitated. Statements from Hungary were very similar to those from other countries. The statement's assertion that there would be no Ukraine in its place after the war was the one that made the greatest impression on me. Following the dissemination of such statements, the morale of the Ukrainian armed forces suffered a significant blow. However, with support from the United States and a large number of other countries, the Ukrainian army was able to take more concrete steps forward. However, the most significant verbal support for the Ukrainian army came from Estonia, a country located in the Baltic region. The statement made by Estonia is that nobody can compel Ukraine to perform the pre-Stokes After making such a startling assertion, Estonia then proceeded to announce a sports package that would include a significant quantity of equipment and ammunition. The aid package, which contains many supplies that the Ukrainian army has recently required, is one of the most significant roadblocks that Russia will face on its way to victory in this conflict. However, the next step that Poland took stunned everyone around the world. Poland has issued a very serious warning to Putin, stating that it is prepared to use its armed forces. Poland is one of the countries that has supported Ukraine since the very beginning of the war, especially in foreign policy. This is due to the widespread belief in that region that Poland is another target of Russia's aggression. Poland has been a supporter of Ukraine since the very beginning of the war. Since the beginning of the conflict, the Polish government has dispatched a large number of tanks to Ukraine in addition to these tanks in the belief that Russia will not be able to launch an attack against Poland as a direct consequence of Russia's failure to successfully invade Ukraine. By making these most recent statements, it has demonstrated to the entire world how serious it is regarding the situation in Ukraine. The Polish government has publicly stated that they are prepared for war in the event that Russia invades Kiev. This situation left everyone in the world perplexed. There is a great deal of uncertainty regarding the specific kinds of challenges that will be faced by the world, which has recently become subdivided into two distinct poles as a direct result of the rising degree of hostility in recent times. If things keep going the way they are, the entire world will be forced to deal with a major crisis. But recent aggressive policies implemented by Putin have begun to form the basis for this situation, and the real harsh reaction came from Putin himself. Putin's belligerent behavior came from a direction that he had not anticipated. His opposition to global peace has, as of late, begun to produce a significant increase in issues. However, as a consequence of the reflection on these issues, particularly in nations that enjoy a high level of prosperity, everyone began to turn against Russia. Because Russia's coming to such an aggressive point can have completely different outcomes, the Ukrainian army has now taken some new steps as a result of Russia's threats to fire missiles even at the countries with the highest trade volume today. This is due to the fact that Russia's coming to such an aggressive point can have completely different outcomes. As soon as Putin made his most recent move, the G7 countries began to prioritize the ongoing conflict in their regularly scheduled meetings. After coming to the conclusion that it is imperative for Ukraine to emerge victorious from this conflict, the countries decided to take action and provide a significant amount of support. Japan, which was known to be pro-peace since the beginning of the war, was one of the countries that came as the biggest surprise at this point in the conflict. Since the beginning of the conflict, Japan has provided approximately $550 million to the Ukrainian army for the sole purpose of providing humanitarian aid. However, in light of these most recent developments, Japan has increased the amount of support it provides to Ukraine by a factor of 11. Putin has lost his mind, despite the fact that this support has a cost and a positive impact across the world. The situation for the Russian army is extremely precarious due to the fact that even the rationale behind why Russia began the war cannot be supported. It was known that Russia was turning to various alliances due to its increasing isolation in foreign policy. However, the country with which it most recently allied itself has surprised people all over the world. Despite the fact that there are many countries in the world, Russia has successfully taken control of the sole nation that could pose a threat to Ukraine. This was Iran, a country that is currently ruled by a dictatorship and is widely regarded as the primary source of many problems. Because Iran is capable of contributing to a global war, the Russian army has evolved into a very significant danger in today's world. The G7 nations, fully aware of the connection between these two factors, have proposed a significant embargo strategy in support of the decision. This action, which will fuel the revolts of the people due to Russia's economic difficulties, could endanger both the Putin government and the Russian state, which is already in a very precarious position. The actions that could be taken by the Ukrainian army will become more likely as a consequence of such a significant loss for Putin. In addition, Russia will be compelled to give up its obstinacy in the region surrounding Ukraine. The outcome of the war was drastically altered as a result of this development, which provided Russia with a more content Ukraine that was also free of Russian occupation. Many of Russia's problems, according to experts on war and politics, could be solved by removing Putin from power. It is now clear that the uprising of the Russian people against Putin's decades-long dictatorship was entirely warranted, particularly in light of Putin's decision to establish a brand new law enforcement agency solely for the purpose of suppressing protests of this kind. Is considered to be the central idea around which all other concepts revolve. The people of Russia are aware of this fact and are interested in learning where and how their taxes are distributed. On the other hand, Putin is not exactly transparent in this regard. The recent protests of the angry public have reached an entirely new level as a direct result of this development. People who were already angry began to believe that Putin's rule was insufficient and pointless because of this. As a direct consequence of these cells' activities in Russia, people will now begin to relocate to various locations. Who else besides Putin was aware of this? Is making an effort to stop this from happening by stationing his personal army in the vicinity of these regions. But as long as the method of dispersing protests is violence, many steps in Russia are expected to be taken, and thanks to these steps taken by the people in Russia, Putin's Tsara is expected to come to an end in a relatively short amount of time. The United States of America provided a massive moon. Russia searched the Black Sea for a gap through which it could escape. Following the successful passage of U.S. destroyers through the strait, a Russian merchant ship was subsequently disabled. Putin was driven completely insane by these threats against Russia. Following the withdrawal of his fleets from the Black Sea, Russian President Vladimir Putin moved his fleets to the Baltic Sea. But Putin, who experienced a response that was unanticipated here, sparked a major crisis. The Baltic countries came together and took action to prevent Putin from entering this region. Unbelievable events have unfolded in Russia. While the Russian army maintains its occupation in Ukraine, it has begun to have a very different problem with the United States of America. This is in contrast to the situation in Ukraine, where the war has begun to calm down gradually. This time, Putin's attempt to invade Ukraine was unsuccessful, and as a result, he became desperate and began attacking U.S. planes. Despite the fact that this event had significant repercussions all over the world, for the first time in a very long time, the prospect of a third global war has become increasingly likely. However, as a result of the blows dealt by the United States, Putin is now in a very difficult situation. For some time, the United States of America has recently demonstrated a greater commitment to the war effort and has assumed a more hands-on role. Because of this, Putin is in a very precarious position. Because Putin was at a loss for what to do, he shot down an American warship flying in international airspace. This was the root cause of a significant emergency. The nature of the occupation that was taking place in Ukraine started to shift as a result of Russia's actions in this sector. However, the United States swiftly issued a condemnation of Russia and made contact with Turkey. Following the sinking of this ship, Turkey, a nation that has been a member of NATO for a very long time, opened the straits to the United States. The United States made the decision to hold NATO exercises in this area. The number of NATO ships heading into the Black Sea was significantly increased. Upon becoming aware of this, Vladimir Putin immediately began searching for a location in which he could conceal his fleet. The news shocked outlets all over the world. The majority of the countries that had placed their confidence in Russia's ability to resolve this issue have now chosen an alternative course of action. Even China made the decision to take a fresh look at its bilateral relations with Russia. The press from all over the world gave this event a significant amount of attention. However, the follow-up action taken by the United States caused a significant problem. During the exercises, the United States demonstrated a high degree of self-assurance by firing missiles. As one missile after another was deployed by the United States near the port of Sebastopol and many other areas, Russia was put under a significant amount of pressure. Putin, who was responsible for the complete evacuation of those areas, overlooked a minor detail. It was discovered that a Russian merchant ship was nearby. The ship was sunk by the United States of America in spite of the necessary warnings. This infuriated Vladimir Putin to no end. Putin was taken aback by the ease with which NATO could move its ships through the Black Sea, and he was at a loss for what action to take next. However, after coming to the conclusion that he would not be making active use of the fleets in this region again, he organized them to sail to a different region. The Baltic states, however, provided a response to this maneuver. As a result of the consistent policies that Vladimir Putin has been pursuing for some time now, there has been a backlash against Putin all over the world. In particular, the countries that had previously been a part of the Soviet Union were aware of how problematic these expansionist policies were. As a result, a great number of countries started to take action. Nevertheless, in spite of these precautions, the Baltic countries were extremely irate because the Russian army insisted on coming to this region when Russia's new targets were revealed as a result of the information revealed by Israeli intelligence. After Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the Baltic countries came to a shocking decision and signed it. At this point in time, it does not appear likely that Russia will be able to achieve this goal. It will initiate a brand new operation to launch attacks on the countries that make up Eastern Europe and the Baltic region. After learning this information, the Baltic states have decided that they no longer want Russian ships to enter this region. The response to Putin, who continues to send his ships and nuclear submarines to the Baltic region after Russia's difficulties in the Black Sea, came as a result of the actions of these countries, is that these countries are responsible for the answer. A great number of nations, led by Norway, had started to find Putin's behavior to be the most troubling. As a result, Vladimir Putin was surrounded, and a large number of aircraft and ships were directed toward him. Due to the fact that these fleets were experiencing difficulties in this region, Putin searched for a new location to move the fleets to. I'm at a loss as to what to do. Norway dispatched a large number of airplanes, which primarily flew patrols over the ships in this area. The Russian military was alarmed by the exercises that Sweden was conducting in this region because Russia, which does not want to get involved in a war in the Baltics, no longer has a choice. In the event that it maintains the same policies in the Baltics, a significant response to the Russian army may emerge from there. This will bring about a further escalation of tension, which has recently become a very serious issue, and it has the potential to bring about the outbreak of World War III, which is something that is constantly being considered. Analysts of the conflict believe that the Ukrainian army is currently in a very fortunate position. Because of his poor decisions, Putin began to bring about his own destruction. No one was entirely sure what was going on in Russia, which was experiencing severe difficulties with its foreign policy. Would do. Following all of these setbacks, Putin, who is often referred to as a dictator, has no choice but to bring an end to this conflict. If he continues the war, he will not be able to stop the Ukrainian army from making advances in many areas, which will lay the groundwork for a significant crisis. However, there is an even more significant issue. Since the beginning of the conflict, Putin has made numerous promises, but not a single one of them has been kept because he has ignored so many things. As a result of these issues, the Russian army is at a complete loss as to what course of action to take. When Ukraine first started to use these problems to make moves against Russia, everything had already begun to change drastically. However, the information gathered since the beginning of the war demonstrates that Russia is currently facing a number of significant challenges. Both the Russian military and economy appeared to be in relatively good shape when the war first started in Russia. The Russian army was quite modern. However, the crisis facing the Russian army was initially made worse by Putin's poor management. The lack of funds necessary to fund the production of new arms has contributed to the worsening economic crisis. This resulted in an increase in inflation and created even greater difficulties in a period of time when the Russian economy was already experiencing difficulties. It is documented that Russia lost many of its advantages in the aftermath, and if it continues in this way, it is anticipated that the war will end in a short amount of time. Because Ukraine has significantly surpassed Russia in terms of both its economic standing and its level of modernization. Because of this situation, the groundwork has been laid for the Russian army to face very serious challenges in the near future. Should things continue to develop in this manner, the Russian armed forces will disintegrate in a very short period of time. The collapse of the Russian military is often interpreted to mean the collapse of the Russian state. It's possible that this will put Putin in an entirely new predicament with his problems. Since quite some time, Russia has been experiencing a shortage of available soldiers to serve in the armed forces. The Russian soldiers who were conscripted into service against their will as a form of mobilization are now confronted with a very significant challenge. The Russian army does not have any newly manufactured ammunition or equipment. It is now anticipated to deal with a much more severe crisis. This is due to the fact that Russian soldiers are facing Ukrainians who are almost completely unarmed. Because of this situation, Ukraine is able to continuously make progress, whereas the Russian army is falling further and further behind. There is no way for Russia to stop this advance using any of its resources. On the other hand, it was taught that the rise of the Ukrainian army was capable of causing significantly more damage to the Russian army. At this juncture, however, the contradictory comments made by work analysts generated a great deal of surprise all over the world. The actions that the Ukrainian soldiers have taken on a variety of fronts, according to analysts of the conflict, will permit the war to progress to a different point. The ongoing improvement of the strength of the Ukrainian armed forces is at the core of these steps. As a result of this, the Russian army is facing a major crisis. In the event that things continue as they are, numerous resignations will be submitted one after the other in Russia.